going to 3 today or 3:30?
I can do either.
3? Okay.
Does anybody want to stay till 3:30? I don't know.
I just didn't remember if we had scheduled it.
Okay.
that
I
way.
scheduled for 3 p.m.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a meeting at 3 that I got to get to.
Yeah. Okay. So it's good to have everybody back. I'm going to ask Mike, do you have anything you want to say, Mike?
I don't, other than I did read some of the correspondence that we received.
I know, yeah.
Very interesting suggestions in there, so I hope we have a chance to discuss some of those today.
Okay. Well, do folks want to start talking about the survey, and maybe we can have some of the, we need to evolve some recommendations from that survey. So are folks ready to do that? Mike,
Yep.
do you want to say something?
I'm happy to do that. I would point out that I'm sure, I don't know if this was sent to everybody, maybe just to me, I'm not sure, but there was one communication I received that seemed to say that employees were reluctant or intimidated or afraid to respond to the survey and therefore did not. And I don't know what to make about that, but I guess that's possible that people didn't believe us when we said it was purely anonymous, et cetera. But I mean, it was a relatively small sample as these things go, as I understand it, but it was still sufficient to get a read, I think. So, but I did get that, and I just thought I would throw it out there in case anyone else had any thoughts on that.
I would just, if I could comment on that, that's my experience with employee surveys, especially the first time. I think I might have mentioned this before. There's always a fair degree of suspicion, despite how many, statements you make about that it's anonymous. I think there's always some people that just don't believe it, and they think somehow there's a secret code on there and that we're going to identify them and they're going to get fired. I think until you do a few surveys and the employees start to realize you actually are paying attention to it and doing something, that's when your response rate goes up. So I'm not surprised at all by that, Mike. I think it's actually to be expected.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I'm just pointing out that I received that information and I thought we should at least acknowledge that some people apparently feel that way. And I'm not sure how to reassure them other than to say, I have no idea who responded to these surveys. I don't think anyone else does. And plus, it's worth noting that in state law, there's a very clear whistleblower protection that if you were revealing anything that was sort of corrupt or mismanagement or waste, let alone racial discrimination, that type of thing, or sexual harassment, you're protected, even if you do it publicly and attach your name to it. So, but got it. And but I have to say the survey, I wasn't really surprised at the results. It kind of confirms the anecdotal stuff we've been hearing. So, there you go.
Well, I think, from the research perspective, they followed all of the fail safes for protecting anonymity. And I agree with Dr. Rodas, because if people have never done it, or if people are in a situation much like we're looking at right now, some of them are very reluctant to tip their hand or even say anything because they have no idea will there be any repercussions. And so I do say that they did follow all of the cardinal rules to protect the anonymity of the people. So
yeah, well, and I also think people who thought the place is wonderful and working fine didn't have that fear of responding.
Which is the way it usually is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
That's our concern. I would say it speaks to the culture, though I'm sure any of us could do surveys, and there's going to be a percentage of that in all of our organizations. I think we just have to notice it and pay attention.
I think we have to acknowledge it when we write about the survey, just to say that we did receive this letter. We don't know how many people this applies to, whether it's the writer or whether it's a large number of people, and say that we don't know whether this statistically skews the survey or not, but just acknowledge that it's an issue.
Yeah.
Excuse me. It's been kind of frantic down here today with the winds and the rains and trees falling over. So I agree. I agree that we do, but I also, I'm wondering if we would want to entertain any, recommendations from the survey itself. What did it tell us? And did we, I echo the previous sentiment that it just in many respects verified my own sense of what was going on. But yes, Dr. Hauser.
So over the past couple of weeks, as we've been, kind of thinking about the survey results and trying to think about recommendations, there were sort of two broad things that came to my mind that I wanted to bring forward as recommendations or sort of areas of recommendation. And I think the first is staffing, because a lot of things sort of tumble from that, from the staffing shortages. It contributes to a lot of other problems in terms of the morale and the programming and things of that nature. So this is certainly something that's not new. I remember going to rallies at the governor's mansion and at the Capitol in my first year at Whiting back in 2007. And I'm sure it was an issue long before I showed up. But so it's been a perpetual issue of vacancies not being filled, people retiring, not filling those. And I think the solution has to come from like literally the top down, meaning like the governor's office or DAS, where things start. Like something drastic needs to happen, needs to change with respect to like hiring practices or hiring rules or whatnot. Positions, like for instance, when somebody vacates a position, my understanding is that the administration needs to seek approval to have that position even posted anew after the person leaves it. I don't know why the default wouldn't be that the position needs to be refilled unless you hear otherwise. If a body was in it, on Tuesday, then a body needs to be in it on Wednesday. So
I just want to stop you right there, Lori. That's the pro forma for the way in which the state works.
Yeah,
it is, but I'm questioning whether it has to be that way.
Yeah,
I'm questioning whether it has to be that way. Huh?
It does unless they change personnel rules.
Right.
Yeah. So Lori, if I could just jump in, and I certainly can't speak on behalf of my former agency, but I do know that's the policy of OPM, which is creating the problem here. And whether it can be changed and how it should be changed is beyond my ability to describe, but yeah, I mean, that's the policy. And yeah. I know it affects all state agencies, including a lot of agencies that direct care, including like the Department of
I have to say though, Dr. Hauser has a point, because it's really difficult when you're providing healthcare to have to wait till someone vacates and then go through the process. I don't know how it is now, but before it was very tedious, especially when you have people who have special needs. So it isn't, I don't know if it's out of the realm of what we would actually want to recommend, but perhaps that's a recommendation we should make. Because yes, Dr. Rodas.
Can I just add, trust me, I'm not defending it. I'm just explaining it's
me too.
Across the board OPM policy that applies to all state agencies, including a lot of agencies that have this exact same problem that provide direct care. And I'm all for recommending some changes to that, but I just want to point out it's nothing unique to DMIS or Whiting.
No, I know that's why I was saying I think it needs to something drastic needs to happen from the top down. Like this is bigger than the hospital. It's something that affects all state agencies, but
Yes,
Dr.
Dr. Otis.
If I could put on my former management hat for a moment, I think this is not unusual. It's frankly, it's well within the norm outside of state agencies. I can tell you that hospital health systems work the same way. I think it's good management, actually. It's frustrating to a lot of employees. You say, you knew so-and-so was leaving. Why do we have to go through a process? Because I think truthfully, sometimes you could figure out how to make do, and it's frankly good business. But that doesn't mean, though, that it should disrupt operations or put people at risk. I think you have to work within the system, know how to expedite the process, go through the chain of command, so to speak, so that it shouldn't slow things down. But I don't think we're going to probably change the rules of state employee, replacements. But I don't find this all that. To me, this has been standard of care for a long time. I think it's the way a lot of businesses run. I don't think it's necessarily bad either. You just need to work. You need to know how to work within the system.
And can I just add?
Kim.
I
Kim?
think I agree with everything that our illustrious doctor has said. However, I also think since the pandemic and because of the pandemic and because of such shortages at such intense places like Whiting, and I think we should make recommendations like this if we feel we need to. Can there be another way to do it? If it's a pandemic, if it's an emergency shortage, if it's deemed that, because I think, first of all, always saying just do it the way we've always done it isn't good. And even if we think it will never change, I still think we should put in what we believe. Again, I think it's good management because you kind of reassess your positions all the time and how are they working within the whole scope of it. But I think, again, for me, the pandemic, an emergency situation, I think we have to be able to hire people quicker.
And
Well,
can I add one more
okay.
piece to this worth considering? I think as we all, or I'm sure almost all of us are aware that there's this tsunami of retirements due about a year from now in state government, and how state government deals with that, all of those vacancies that will be created very quickly among very experienced people, how they backfill that is going to be a real challenge. But at the same time, it's an opportunity for places like Whiting. Maybe they should get authorization to, hire X number of people starting now, because, and I'm not a healthcare expert by any stretch, but I am generally aware that it's hard to hire qualified healthcare people at the moment, and especially among the most challenging environments like Whiting and CVH. So this is a huge challenge, and if you're following the newspapers, you see this exact same problem is occurring in the Department of Correction with their healthcare system. And I mean, this is a real challenge going forward. And I've always argued that this is another reason to limit the number of people put in these types of facilities as patients, limit that as much as possible, right? And I continue to believe there's way too many people at Whiting and CVH that need to be there. And I feel the same way about the Department of Correction. So I'm just throwing that out there, those points.
Let me just editorialize a bit and say, in some situations, you can limit how many admissions you will have. And that is a way in which you can balance your staffing. But I think that some of the staff reporting of being mandatory overtime for weeks on end, that really does compromise care. It compromises the health of both the patient and the provider, and if it lasts a long time, it's almost criminal to expect people to take on a very difficult task of taking care of folks.
But then I guess my question is, how does this contrast with what Nancy had in the piece that she wrote up about the census being down? If the census is
we
down,
haven't got to that yet. We're just talking about, what we saw in the survey.
right? But if we're talking about staffing and you have less people, then you need less staff.
Right.
But the only way you can do that is,
but let me ask you this, Paul. Was it your understanding when you heard the staff that was the case, that they are doing double shifts and they don't there's a low census? Is that what you were thinking, or?
Well,
help me with this?
it seems like we have two different pieces of information coming into this. We have a staffing issue, but at the same time, they just closed Unit 6 because they don't have the census.
No, they closed Unit 6 because they didn't have the staff. It wasn't because of census. It was
Oh,
because
okay.
it was because they were short-staffed and they declared an emergency that they couldn't provide safe care for people on the unit, not because of the
So
census.
so they're overcrowding the other units then.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Now I understand that better. Thank you.
Yes, Dr. Hauser?
Well, and so I want to also add, like when you were asking about mandatory overtime, like mandatory overtime that used to be, like, I mean, long ago, used to be reserved for literal emergencies. I mean, it was not the standard, but again, since like there was a mass retirement exodus in 2009, that's what resulted in the closure of Unit 5, and then just sort of normal retirements and people, attrition and things like that since then, without being refilled, has just led to the chronic understaffing, to where mandatory overtime has just slowly become more of the norm or more of the accepted practice, when it was supposed to be reserved for those like true crucial situations, not just because of a random Tuesday where you didn't have sufficient staff.
Well, it just kind of folds in that perhaps we should ask Nancy to talk about what she put in, because I think it is the picture. But when you have people doing mandatory overtime, sometimes things do go wrong and people miss, especially in healthcare, miss important things. And so to rely on mandatory overtime for months at a time, and if we were, when we heard that they were not allowed to take time off, et cetera, that suggests that they really do need to do a better job of recruiting or getting people on board, and/or, we've talked about some of the competency and so forth being done on an outpatient basis. But the issue is when you're tight like that, and anybody that's been in a psych unit knows things can happen very quickly, and people who are tired and worn out are not going to be at their best.
Can I just add one more piece to this puzzle with regard to the overall staffing picture? So like for the nursing staff, the folks that are considered essential, there have to be the nursing staff and certain numbers of psychiatry and medical and whatnot, like those positions, somebody is mandated to be in that position if somebody else isn't, right? So it's covered. It might be covered with mandatory overtime, but it's covered. The other positions like psychiatry, psychology, social work, unit directors, things like that, do not get overtime, and those positions are not covered when those people are out. So when those discipline vacancies, the work just gets shuffled to other people. So, you have this situation where, in the discipline, in one disciplines, people are working mandatory overtime all the time and tired and overworked. And then the other disciplines, they're being stretched to cover other vacancies until those positions are filled. So it's, two kind of Band-Aid approaches to getting the work done, but neither of which is ideal.
And one of the things that I just remembered that I did not put in that little document that I did is that, and I can amend it if we think it's important. But one of the things we heard a lot when we were hearing from the residents at Whiting and CVH was that because of the staffing shortages, they have no ability to do some of the kinds of activities that make the place a little bit more livable. They don't have the opportunity to go out to a store, to restaurants, or even walk around the campus if they don't have privileges that allow them to walk around by themselves. And all of these kinds of things, it's been sort of narrowed down to the essentials of keeping the units running. And it was so bad that DEMA's staff was saying it wasn't safe, and that's why they had to close a unit. So it really confirms not only what we heard from staff in the survey, but it confirms what the residents were telling us about the problems with the staff shortage. So it's highly significant what happened with Unit 6.
And that's also why I think this
Go
sort of overarching problem that affects a lot of others, right? It affects the amount of programming that can happen. It affects how quickly things get done. It affects people's morale, affects people's well-being, and affects their ability to do their jobs safely and that kind of thing. And so that sort of, it creates this downward spiral of other issues that I think the staffing has to be addressed first.
Yes, Dr. Redis.
So I think to recap, maybe summarize, I think we've identified a significant problem in the staffing. And, when you have a staffing problem like this, it's usually a combination of a budgetary constraint, a recruitment constraint where you just can't find qualified people, a retention problem where you have high turnover. There's nothing good about overtime from a management point of view. It's more costly. So it's not in management's interest to pay people overtime. So usually the problem is they can't recruit people or have people to replace those people when they're out. So they make people do mandatory overtime. But I think management needs to do what I would consider a comprehensive approach to their workforce and see what their problems are. Are the problems recruitment? Is it retention? Is it they're not paying enough? Is it a budgetary constraint? But there's nothing good about it. Besides the points you made, Linda, which are very important, I think, in healthcare, that it's a risk, it's a safety issue when people are overworked and overtired. It's a burnout issue. The staff get burnt out. It's you're losing, as you got to the points that Lori made, the other support services start getting less available. So it becomes a decline in services provided. And when you burn out your staff more, you have higher turnover. More people leave. So it's a self-perpetuating thing. So I think a comprehensive approach, I think clearly an important part of our report has to be, that management takes this labor issue very, very seriously. And I don't know how else to say it, but I think we've kind of hit all the points. It's something I'm missing.
Well, we did talk
Nancy, by the way,
about
I think your letter was perfect. I think it was very specific to what happened on Unit 6.
So early on, we talked about a master plan. And I think that is one of the other aspects of the master plan, that you not only would want to look at what are the current trends in treatment, but what is the patient to staff ratio that needs to be maintained. Those are the kinds of things that if you have a pause, you can actually, work that out. Although CMS and has some of those kind of parameters of what your patient, how many hours and so forth that you have to have per patient for staff. So Nancy, do you want to just kind of go through what you did? Thank you for doing that. And
well, I mean, it pretty much, speaks for itself. Talking about it's like what happened on Unit 6 was a culmination of the severe staffing shortages that we've heard about and that the survey talked about and that the residents confirmed, and that as it has a negative impact on both patient care and staff morale. And we also, and I think we talked about this a bit at the last meeting, is how, and I know that we got letters about this as well. And we should talk about those letters too. But, housing PSRB patients with competency patients, which most of us seem to think that this is a real problem and is done, as I said at the end, for administrative convenience rather than patient care. So what this did was it just confirmed everything that we had understood was going on. And it was not, what was important, I think, was this was not just well, it wasn't exactly a lawsuit, but a motion that was filed relating to an old consent decree, but that Demas officials agreed it was an emergency. There wasn't a factual dispute about that issue. There were factual disputes about the legal implications and whether it was a violation of the consent decree, and we don't need to get into that. None of that's important to us. But both sides agreed that staffing was a critical issue, and it's obviously not just Unit 6, and it obviously didn't happen in May when they first started talking about it and informed patients, but it's a long-standing problem to have gotten to the place where it became an emergency. So it was in, the timeliness of this whole thing, just was interesting.
So what happened? The lawsuit, where is that now?
What happened with it, it's not technically a lawsuit, as I said. There was a consent decree signed in, I forgot what year, 87, something like that. And there was a motion filed in May alleging that when that the consent decree requires that patients be given prior notice for moves, and that the moves be made for reasons of patient care, not for other reasons. And the motion alleges that this wasn't done. Now, that's not what we care about at all. That's not something that relates to us. And where the litigation is at this point is the plaintiffs had filed for a motion, a temporary restraining order to stop the move. The judge denied that, but they are still litigating the issue as to whether or not the way they did these moves violated the consent decree. So did they not comply with the consent decree? And that is still pending. And they're supposedly in talks to try to resolve that. And if not, they'll go back to court and continue the litigation. But that's where things stand now.
So does anyone have any questions? Comments?
Well, my only comment would be that is symptomatic of what we were just discussing a few minutes ago, right? I mean, they're clearly short-staffed. Whether they're able to staff it up, who knows? I mean, can they even hire people? Even if they had the green light to do it, can they even bring people on board? That's the question. And with what is an apparent morale problem there, I'm guessing they have a problem retaining people they've got, And it seems like, based on the survey at least, it seems like the biggest problem is at the lower professional levels, let's just say, right? The sort of entry level positions where people tend to get paid the least, where the racial disparity is the most pronounced. And that seems where a lot of the dissatisfaction can be found. And in the survey, as you went up sort of the ranks in terms of professional credentials, people generally seem to be more satisfied with the work environment there. So I think sort of like a toxic mix here that seems to be spiraling in the wrong direction. And, so one potential remedy is this motion that's been filed in court But even if the plaintiffs are successful here, somebody has to get the place staffed up with properly trained folks, and that seems like a huge challenge. An alternative,
And
of course, is to have fewer patients, but we'll see.
let's not forget also that Demas is in a bit of flux right now because they have a new acting commissioner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
And we don't know if the governor is going, sorry, Paul, we don't know if the governor is going to appoint a permanent commissioner or not. Given what he's done with some of the other agencies, it looks unlikely that we'll just have an acting commissioner.
Right. And I think we also have to note though that I don't think I think the bullying and the morale issues are exacerbated by this, but I think that it's something that's been going on for decades upon decades. I mean, we hear stories all the time of, staff getting their tires flattened and stuff like that. They come out of their shift. And so, I don't think that this is just this phenomenon. And I'm kind of amazed too, that even as much as, Whiting and CVH has been under the spotlight, that things haven't improved. It's been 4 years since the Shahadi thing came out, and you think that it would be like, okay, let's get this turned around and let's get this going. And it feels like it's just business as usual, which is concerning.
Mm-hmm.
I have to agree with you, Paul. The last thing somebody should have done was try to violate the previous consent decree, to just do it and not even think about.
Well, we don't know what that's happened. And even though
that hasn't been established.
That
yet.
hasn't been established. And
Oh,
even though
okay.
it's my friends who brought the complaint, who brought the motion, it hasn't been established. So it's not fair to say that. It's alleged at this point. That's it.
Yes, Lori.
Well, and I'll say one thing that's, I guess, probably different in my view, and maybe based on the survey results as well, kind of substantiate this, is, and this is like sort of the second part of, like I said, there were two things that I was sort of thinking about in relation to these survey results. And that is sort of like the culture of supervision and training and corrective action and things of that nature that, like, I think probably the biggest difference is we went from an environment where things were almost never addressed or looked at or uncovered or dealt with, to sort of like a scorched earth policy of dealing with problematic behaviors. So I think that is in part what contributes to some of the fear on the part of the staff. So, whereas patients probably worry that they're, never going to get out of Whiting, staff worry that they're never going to make it to retirement. That's sort of that mentality of like always feeling like they're going to walk in and be fired, or, they're going to do something, and because it went from one extreme to the other. And that's the sense that things aren't dealt with via the ongoing channels of supervision and progressive discipline and things like that. It's just sort of, you walk in and wonder if your badge is going to let you in. So I think that's part of what contributes to some of the morale presently.
Any other
I think
thoughts?
that's my way of saying, I guess, like that's another area that I think needs to change. There needs to be a better utilization of supervision and training and re-education and progressive disciplinary practices, rather than it's either this extreme or that extreme.
Any other comments? when we were talking about the results of the survey, I know that we mentioned before that I just got it out here. The perch, the one that was done in 2017 by some of the folks at Yale. I was surprised that and when they did a staff survey, they didn't get a lot of people responding either. Did everybody get this? Because I mean, it's really, I just was looking at in relationship to what we were finding in ours. And I wonder, this was, but I think this was face-to-face kind of interview. And
They were focus groups, Linda.
oh, focus groups, okay. So
And
everybody
they
knew
were,
it.
it was focus groups, and it was specifically the Whiting building. So just the Whiting Max part of Whiting Hospital. So it didn't include Dutcher. It certainly didn't include CVH. They started in the Whiting building, and it took some time before they were able to do the focus groups at Dutcher as well. So this report that we got was based on the focus groups that occurred in the Whiting Max building that year.
So the
It was
anonymity was
61
not there. It was face-to-face. So maybe that kind of reflects why while the staff survey said that 58% of the people said that most of the co-workers treat each other with respect and dignity. And the supervisors and managers treated employees with respect and dignity. Only a third disagreed with that. So that gives you kind of a sense of if you have the anonymity, you might actually get more information and probably something closer to the truth. Yes.
I feel a little passionate about this. I guess just having listened to everything, and again, I haven't been here in a couple meetings, so I apologize, but the overall big picture, it just seems to me, we all know what's going on, right? Maybe not in depth, certainly it's not everybody, but just by the facts of court, we know what's going on. And I think to keep putting it on the clients and even the staff to keep doing more surveys to say, it's like, for me, it's like putting, work on people of color to teach us what's wrong, what we've done that's racist, that we don't understand maybe as white people. I just feel like it's putting more work, and that has to be exhausting for the staff and client, and I mean the clients. It has to be exhausting when you read the letters that people have been there for 10, 20, 30 years. And that's all about the culture. And I just feel like we just have to say that and say change it and get the right people at the right levels to do that. I know it's complicated. I know there's staff, there's unions. I'm not naive about that. But I also think it's not bad for us to make a bold statement saying, listen, no more task force, no more this, no more that. I don't know. Maybe there is one thing we suggest. I don't know. It's an overseeing body, or I don't know what that is, but it just feels like I'm exhausted from it. I can't imagine how, and I am kind of, but not really, but I can't imagine how it must feel to the clients, and how you get their hopes up and then crash them again, and get their hopes up and they're still there for 30 years. Maybe it's too naive, but
Nancy?
And what Kim brings up is something that I think we've sort of let slide in all of our talking about the kinds of changes to make. And we certainly, I think, and I'm as guilty as everybody in terms of letting it slide when we discuss the PSRB, and that is these ridiculously lengthy amounts of time that people are staying there. It is impossible to have any kind of hope when you're sentenced to these ridiculous sentences. And without hope, you're not going to have recovery. And when we were first entertaining people and having people come and talk to us about it, Monty Radler spoke quite passionately about how that was something that needed to change in the PSRB. If we're not going to get rid of the thing, as most of us feel should happen, but if we're still going to have it, that those sentences have got to go. And I don't think we've talked about that in a long time. And if we're going to talk about change, significant change that's going to lead people to real recovery, that's one of the things that we have to tackle, and we can't let that slide.
Yes, Dr. Hauser.
Can I ask, and I know maybe this is a question for Beverly, like a while back we had asked, I thought, like some questions for OLR, or right, you said like if we had questions we could put them forward and they would research them.
I sent the questions to the chairs to make the request of OLR, but as you recall, they were working and getting ready for session, and then the pandemic came.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I have not followed up on that since. If you want me to, I can.
Yeah, I was gonna say, is it still possible to? Because I am curious, like when Ellen LaChance came, she was one of the very first presenters, maybe even the first to speak to us about the PSRB, and she presented those facts and that data. And then there was also the article that Monty provided, the Norco et al. Article from like 2016 that talked about years and things like that. And it might just be like, it's my own anecdotal sense, but I feel like people have been moving more swiftly in the last couple years. And I'm just curious if that's borne out by the data, or if it's just my sense. You know, I mean, I want to know what the facts say. I want to know what the data says, because if things are at least starting to shift in that direction, it'd be good to know. I mean, I think it is something that I'm curious about where we stand today. I think the data that Ellen reported to us stopped at like 2007.
I will revisit the question, Lori.
Okay.
Can I just make a practical suggestion? One of our options would be to, in the various recommendations we forward, would be that the legislature should ask OLR to evaluate all this stuff. So, because I mean, it's the kind of thing that maybe it'll take them 2 or 3 months to get their way through it. So, I mean, rather than waiting until we get that, you can move on, but I mean, a list of things that the legislature should know as they consider policy changes. I mean, they have these extraordinary experts in OLR that can do this kind of work. And so we could turn that into a recommendation to do this research as opposed to waiting to receive it. That's my thought.
I think that makes a lot of sense, except I think, and this is, I think, what Kim was talking about, it sort of prolongs the process. So yet another thing that has to be analyzed before we can get a recommendation. And I kind of hear Kim saying, let's make the recommendations that the legislature can actually do something instead of keeping studying it. So that's the only concern I have.
I think if there was any effort made to get that information, Beverly, that would be good for us to know. But I'm sensing as I'm listening to everyone that people have actually come to some hard and fast thoughts on this as we move forward. And I don't think that we have the time I would like us to come out. We have some very strong feelings about what needs to be done. And I think we should just say it. That's why they asked us to be here. And that's what we've tried to do. And we have some good thoughts. We really do. The important thing is that when we leave this task, that we put it all on the table. We leave it all there. That's why we're here. And I have been working with another project, but I had to remind that project that we're not talking about paper. We're talking about real people and their lives. And the most important thing, we all have an opportunity to make something that isn't so good much better. So do you agree, Paul?
Yeah, I mean, because I think I agree with Kim, because if we're just gonna say that, this needs to be studied more, then why were we here? And like you said, Linda, it's like we do have some solid opinions here. I think a lot of us really question why PSRB is there. I don't want to, I know it's not all of us, and I don't want to speak for the other people who haven't put forth their voice, but it really comes across as a redundant piece of this process. And the question that I think the legislature has to handle is, why is my treatment something that has to be argued over? My treatment should be my treatment. Right. And it shouldn't have to be an adversarial process for me to progress in my treatment.
And it should just be between me and my provider, not me and, some panel.
Yeah.
So Dr. Rodas and Dr. Hauser.
Yeah, I think not to necessarily rehash this stuff, but I think we've got systemic structural problems with the whole process, right? To Mike's point, it's probably too many people there in the first place. There's no easy way out because we don't really have facilities for them to get out to. The PSRB is a legitimate issue that we're going to raise. Separate from that, we have the physical plant issues, which are significant. And then we have a significant management issue. All this other stuff we've been talking about, this first half of this meeting so far, is all about management, the overtime, the stuff. And by the way, the 2017 survey, what a third of the people felt they were treated disrespectfully. It's not exactly good news. I mean, that's still that's a really high number. So, I think we've got a lot of issues here. And I think, but to Mike's point, I don't think we're really dragging our feet if we suggest that people look at the duration of the stays at Whiting, just to validate Lori's point, because she thinks it seems to be getting shorter. And we would obviously encourage that to continue and that be assessed. I don't think that's a study. I think it's just looking at the math, right? I don't think Mike was suggesting some long drawn out study. We just say, let's look at the numbers over the last, 5 years or 10 years. And is there a trend towards shorter sentences or I guess it's not sentences, but shorter durations of stay. But yeah, it's let's face it, guys, this is a freaking overhaul, when you really sum it up.
Okay, Dr. Hauser, then Kim.
Yeah, I pretty much want to reiterate what Dr. Rose said. Also so, Linda and I have been working on putting this report together. There are a lot of recommendations in this report, right? So I think we're making a lot of broad strokes recommendations, and the legislature is going to do what they will. And also, there's been a number of this is an ongoing process. We didn't step into a time warp in March of 2017, and here we are. I mean, a number of the things that we've actually talked about here have been enacted while we've been talking about them, either through other legislative action. Conversations that EMIS has. So it's an ongoing thing. And that's why I'm not suggesting we stop and do another study and then start the process again. I'm saying on an ongoing basis, we should be continually looking at this information, looking at the data, says the psychologist, and deciding whether what is being put into place and what is changing, is that working? Is it working? Are we heading in the direction? And if not, then something different needs to happen. But it doesn't mean that we, all stop and, study this every 3 months. It should be an ongoing thing.
So I agree with everything everyone has said. And here's my issue, though. We have done this before. People have done this before. Task force have done this before. I want to walk away from here saying, here's who, or the legislative, you tell us, but there has to be some body, whether it's a body of people, I think that's what it is, and not a body, but maybe there has to be someone who is going to be responsible and accountable moving forward. And people say this about state government in general, and I'm not belittling anything because we're all so busy, but we know this, but everything comes up, a pandemic comes up, an opioid crisis comes. I mean, we have to have something that's focused enough with I'd hate to go say, but a real timeline that says, and again, things can move and shift, but says who is responsible, who has to make sure that the things that we decide on, or the legislature decide on, or people in recovery get to decide on, people who have been in Whiting and Dutcher. We have to be able to follow up and see the data, see what we're going to do, what we think works by best practice or by data that it's worked in other places, and then who's responsible to make it happen. And when.
I can tell you who's responsible. Who is responsible is the governor's designate as the commissioner. They are the ones. And I did that for 11 years, and I can tell you that some days are good, some days are not so good.
I know,
But you cannot shirk the duty that is your responsibility. And I have a hunch that because Demas is so broad and has so many aspects to it, that it's almost impossible. But I think one of the things that we have come up with, this Office of the Inspector General, could really be a tool
that would be it.
that we could leave, part of our legacy, that people can go someplace, somebody's going to take a look at it, and then the process of having to have people respond and some corrective action taken in the end. That is the only way it's going to go. But I could say this from my experience. Yes, if the governor is not on board with this, or if the governor's staff is not on board with this, then you have a problem. Then it is the people. It is the people. And if there was enough outcry with this particular incident, that is, first of all, not worthy of the people of our state, and it's not worthy of the people that are entrusted to the care of the state in these facilities. So we have been working. I wanted to at least kind of fill you in that Lori and I have been working on this, but it's not ready for prime time. But I'm thinking right now what we should do, and I would be willing to do this, is instead of we have a lot of, like foo-foo in between, but if we brought forth the basic, like bullets of what we have decided, would that could guide us as we went forward. And the other thing that I ask is there any stone we have not turned? Is there anybody else we want to listen to? Okay, Dr. Hauser.
Having looked through the report recently, there were two things I think that I saw where we said we need to talk further. One is the community piece, the community services. Yes. Like we talked about before, a huge problem it's part of the system. So a huge problem in getting people out is having adequate place to put them. And so we haven't really, I think, decided, and we've talked about it, but didn't come up with a specific recommendation about that yet. And then I think the other thing was the piece about the definitions of behavioral health facility and the definition of neglect. The only question I had about the neglect piece was sort of how to make sure that that's crafted and defined so that that has a lot of potential to be very subjective. Like what one person might think is allowing someone, freedom, independence to take care of themselves. Someone else might think is you're being neglectful, right? So there's sort of room for people to disagree about what's providing adequate care. So those are the only pieces that I could discern from the report as it exists that I thought we needed to discuss a little more.
You're talking about conceptualizing what neglect is? Or
yeah, so one of the charges I think had to do with, the defining behavioral health facility, whatnot. Nancy, I think you wrote this piece up. And then the other part was about defining neglect, because I think, abuse was defined or put into, as a mandated report, but the other piece was about neglect. And I remember when think it was Dr. Schwartz that came and spoke to us about this. Like we had some discussion.
Not me, it was the other Dr. Schwartz.
Not you, yeah, not this Dr.
He was coming from,
Right,
really.
but so we had a conversation about like kind of making sure that that is defined in such a way that what I think is allowing somebody, you know, freedom and independence, make their own decisions, decide on their own care, their own, that kind of thing. Someone else isn't saying you're being neglectful because you're not providing them adequate care. Is it? That was what I took.
Well, since you brought this up, I actually thought I had asked Nancy to help to write up a definitive. Maybe Paul and Nancy could work on neglect versus, because first of all, you know so much about the law. And second of all, you're right. I mean, many moons ago, I was a public health nurse on the streets of Norwich, and all of my patients had just been discharged from Norwich Hospital. And I had a grant from this, my agency had a grant from the state that I could see anyone that we needed to. And we needed to see a lot of people because they didn't know how to get groceries. They didn't know where to get their medicines. So for years, it was that it was not, it was, of course, helping them stay. That's the other thing. We had a measurement. How did we measure if we were doing our jobs? There were 3 nurses. And we measured our success on how long we could keep our patients out of the hospital. That was how we measured.
I'm coming up with, actually, Linda was the one who had done that work for us, but I'm sending you a definition of neglect right now. That's the definition in the PAMI statute, Protection and Advocacy for Individuals with Mental Illness.
It's we have it in the report so far, those statutory definitions you provided, I think.
But Nancy, we need to have some maybe examples of where, giving the patient the opportunity to, it's not going to always go perfect. Sometimes they do fail, but going back to the 3 nurses, we were supposed to be there if they fell. We're supposed to help them get back up. And that was the kind of system that Connecticut did have.
So my little pushback on this is Connecticut has adopted the recovery model, and the person is supposed to be in charge of their treatment to the best of their ability from get-go. There's not a certain level that they have to reach in order to take that responsibility. Or to have that responsibility. So the person is supposed to be in charge of their treatment. They have the right to refuse medications. They have the right to, yada, yada, yada. But it's like, that's the model that Connecticut has adopted. And last I heard, there wasn't like a Whiting exception that we have the recovery model everywhere but Whiting. And so to the best of that person's ability, they should be able to have as much independence as they can take on. And to me, that's not neglectful. That's doing what we're supposed to be doing. Because what happens is we get in these situations where it becomes very paternalistic, and we get to the point where we put the person in a box, and then we want, they don't get any light in the box, and then we wonder why they don't grow. And you're right, Linda, everyone fails. And the fact is that if you aren't going to let the person fail, then you aren't going to let them succeed either.
Well, it's the whole dignity of risk.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
if they don't fail, then you also compromise their capacity to grow.
Right.
right. And so, and I'm with you on that principle. My question, or I guess my concern is, and I believe this is what Dr. Schwartz was talking to us about, is
Could you just say, not Linda, the other guy.
Not Linda, the other
Well, was he from the
Hank Schwartz from IOL, used to be at IOL.
the Institute of Living?
Is the issue that if somebody is all right, so if we're like, I may think that this person's able to live in the community, they can take care of themselves, that, and you know, as the healthcare provider, I put them in this supervised apartment where they're by themselves for most of the day, and they do something unsafe, and it results either in their harm or somebody else's harm, whatever. I think the concern from community providers was being called up on neglect for failure to, like, for making that decision to say they were capable of doing that. So that's the thing, is there's competing principles here. Yes, the recovery model says that, but the question is being able to define what neglect is,
Well, I
so
just
that
sent you,
somebody isn't being
Okay,
yeah, I just sent you a definition of neglect.
so failure by a caregiver through action or reaction to provide an individual services necessary to maintain his or her physical, mental health and safety, right? That one?
No, the term neglect means a negligent act or omission by any individual responsible for providing services in a facility, rendering care or treatment, which caused or may have caused injury or death to an individual with mental illness, or which placed an individual with mental illness at risk of injury or death, and includes an act or omission such as the failure to establish or carry out an appropriate individual program plan or treatment plan for an individual with mental illness, the failure to provide adequate nutrition, clothing, or health care to such individual, or the failure to provide a safe environment for an individual with mental illness, including the failure to maintain adequate numbers of appropriately trained staff. That's a statutory definition in the federal statutes of neglect.
So that's adopted across the country?
Yes.
Yes,
That
In the
is,
federal.
that's federal.
that's federal. That is the definition of neglect in the PAMI Act.
Oh, okay. So then what's the one that you provided that says further, we recommend the neglect within the behavioral health context be defined to include failure by a caregiver through action or interaction? Where did that come from?
Kim came up with that one.
And that came from the Joint Commission, I believe.
Right.
Okay, so I guess that would be a question, like, should we look at a couple different definitions of neglect and decide which one makes the most sense?
maybe that's what, let's do that at our next meeting. Let's have all those definitions and let's decide what we want to do here. Does that sound fair? Yes, Kim?
Can we really decide if it's a federal,
Yeah, if it's a federal law, that's
and
the
it's a
floor.
joint accreditation? I can't change that.
Right.
But one of our
No.
charges was to review the statutory definitions of abuse and neglect in the behavioral health context. So I think we're being asked to
We
make
can.
recommendations about what
We
they-
can do
But
anything.
we also have to, I mean, there's federal definitions and it's in different contexts. And there's going to be state definitions. So it depends, there are different definitions depending.
Well, do
on
we
the
have
context.
we have three definitions on the table now?
3?
Yeah,
There's-
Kim, Nancy's.
We have the federal law, we have J code. Do we have how the state has defined it?
Does it define it in the Patient's Bill of Rights? I'm trying to remember.
No, not
No,
to my knowledge.
Yeah, I don't think so. I'm not sure. Let me look.
So maybe, like Linda suggested, we should look into those different definitions, bring those to the table next time and kind of decide which one we would.
Well,
we
but
could
that's
do-
not, that's, I'm concerned about doing it that way because that sort of depends upon what we all know. That might be another question for OLR to come up with, to give us different definitions of neglect. And that way I wouldn't feel that we're just depending upon, pulling out of our own individual knowledge bases, which could certainly miss a bunch of stuff.
Well, Beverly, can we ask OLR for different definitions of abuse and neglect? But I would also say that if we saw something that was fit what we think needs to be done here, that's within our peer review to make that recommendation.
Yeah,
And recommending that the OLR or the public health should look at this. Well, we've looked at the problem area here, and we probably have some important additions to what is being put forward by other agencies. So hello, Beverly. Okay. Do you think OLR, what kind of a turnaround do you think OLR could have on, we want to look at different definitions of abuse and neglect of patients, especially psychiatric patients.
I don't know. I'll have to have a legislator check with them. I cannot make that request to OLR. So I will check with Jonathan or Mary or one of the ranking members to ask that.
Okay.
Thanks.
So Lori and I can, what we're going to do is we're just going to, maybe people have forgotten some of the things that we have agreed on, voted on, and so forth. So we can have that for the next meeting, and that can be our discussion. These are the points that we have agreed on so far. Anything, and we'll our recommendations, the OLR looking at abuse and neglect. Is there anybody, have we heard from everybody we want to hear from?
I think so. I think there'll always be someone we didn't, or some organization. And I think we got to also, and that was my question. And I'm sorry if I missed this, someone could tell me this offline if it's not a quick answer, but are we following a roadmap to get to an endpoint here? And we're on that. And I mean, I don't remember it, and that's my fault. So.
No, that's okay. All right. Are there any other comments about what's going on? Well, I'm not hearing any. Is there any other business to come before the crew today? The task force.
Can I just mention one thing? In one of the letters we received from—
Oh, yes, the letters.
Mhm.
I forget his name now, but he apparently had a lot of experience working in the criminal courts. And I'm not sure this is something we should pursue, but I just want to say he suggested doing a survey of people working in the courts, meaning the prosecutors and the judges. And from the tone of his letter, you can
His
read
name was Robert Byron.
Yes. And from the tone of his letter, I think he was, well, he was kind of explicit when he said this. He thought that the people making these decisions in court, judges and prosecutors, and to some extent defense attorneys, were, let's just say, I think his words were woefully underinformed about dealing with persons with mental illness, or diagnosing it, or making recommendations consistent with it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm not so sure that we should pursue a survey like we did with the employees. And I'm equally confident that very few judges and prosecutors would respond. At least that's been my experience with that kind of thing. But I just want to remind you all that at one point in the past, I said that I personally think there's a systems problem in the courts as they're deciding for when to order a competency evaluation. And my sense is, and it's sort of an informed guess, that it's because they don't know what else to do. And the downside to that, in my opinion, is it puts people in this sort of criminal justice funnel, as opposed to a mental health funnel, that in many cases lands them at Whiting at the end of the funnel, right? And so whether the survey is the right way to do it, or just have somebody like OLR figure out what the numbers are. Are they different on different courthouses? Are some courts more likely to order the 54, 50/60s than other courts are? This is the front end of the problem that I think aggravates everything that Lori and her coworkers deal with at Whiting. And
So does the, my question is, does Demas or does the state have their own forensic psychiatrists that do these? Or is this like a county thing where they are, they're the ones that if somebody comes into the, say, New Haven and they need to have a competency, is there a psychiatrist or a psychologist assigned?
so as best I understand it, right? So I am a lawyer, I used to be a prosecutor, I do practice law in the criminal court, but I don't pretend to be the current expert on exactly what's going on at the moment. I do know, however, that the culture varies a lot depending on which court you're in. The personality of the judge, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys. Places like New Haven, which have easy access to the Yale clinical faculty, probably are somewhat more sophisticated than you would see in other places in terms of how they, when they order 54, 50/60s. But, that's strictly a court decision to initiate that. That's only lawyers talking to judges. Once it's ordered, then mental health professionals are going to get involved, but that's all going to happen while someone is incarcerated in the Department of Correction, unless they can bond out, which is unusual. And so I'm just saying, like, now you're in a system that's really governed by lawyers, not doctors. And at the end of the day, it's only lawyers and judges that get to make the decisions here, not the doctors. They only make recommendations. And so I think and as I think I said at one point several months ago, based on the data I got from judicial, although the total number of criminal cases coming into the courts has dropped significantly over the past 10 years, the number of competency evaluations being ordered has actually gone up. So bigger number of a smaller number of, bigger percentage of a smaller number of cases. And I'm only guessing that's because police on the front lines don't have any other options. So they arrest people, they end up in court. The judges and the prosecutors, defense attorneys don't really know what to do. So they order a competency hearing in the hopes that mental health professionals can figure out. And now you're sort of in this assembly line, which I'm not sure is the best way to manage this stuff. And so I'm only saying at some point, somebody should try and figure out what these trends really are. Are my guesses accurate here? I mean, is there big difference? Because if there's big differences from court to court, that tells you a lot of this has to do with the culture in that courthouse, the personalities, the people, the judges and lawyers making these decisions. And that's the feeder system, where at the end of the road is CVH and Whiting. And so I think, obviously, to me, like an obvious solution, that is have more options at the very front end so the cops don't have to get out the handcuffs, right? I mean, that would be, unless somebody's really dangerous. And you see this discussion going on in police reform movements. I'm on the New Haven Board of Police Commissioners, and the governor appointed me to post. So these discussions about how to give more options to frontline police are happening right now. But not a lot of this is happening with regard to what happens in the courts, right? And I think it's probably true that giving, making sure the lawyers making these decisions have a better understanding of what the options really are, and maybe sort of deflect people out of the system before they get ordered for a competency evaluation. Because like I said, that's almost always going to happen in a correctional facility, which is exactly where you put somebody if you wanted them to sort of decompensate and get worse. I mean, that's where you would put them, right?
So I think those are important to make, like, all of these, when you say that, kind of click from the front end to the back end, how things are happening, because it's gonna affects all of it. And so I think we should make recommendations, whether it's training for all of them, and then again, how do we make it so, if you go and I guess and say to judge and lawyers, you have to have this training, they still don't have to follow it, right? Or how can there be somebody who can say, here's what you need to do, and it's going to be long term, but at least there's the expert panel, I hate to say panel, who's really watching over this.
Yeah, well, but step one, in my opinion, is like, what are the what's really happening? Can we get some numbers to sort of demonstrate that there really is some kind of weird problem going on here that may have a solution? And in terms of training, okay, of course, training is great, but I mean, I don't know how much training they would have to give me so that I could do triage in an emergency room, right? I'm a lawyer, right? And I think that's the problem here. You have people with serious health issues being delivered to courtrooms and having lawyers figuring out what's the right thing to do. And that to me is the problem here, part of the problem.
This to me is just,
First
a good
First
time.
Kim, then Paul, then
I
Lori.
just want to say why this is such a good time because of police reform. This is the time to be looking at all of that.
It's
Should all the
happening.
courts have a social worker? Should all the courts have a triage person? I just think this is, and we should say that, this is all timely. You know, the place where we're at today in society has been because of all these things. And so here's what we have to do now, or here's what we have to try to do. And then how are we going to all make sure it happens?
Well, the public defenders do have social workers. Let's just be clear about that. But social workers are not, I mean, they're not mental, their skill set is not really mental health. I think it's fair to say. I think the social workers are more, how can we, develop alternative plans for some of our clients in terms of, educational services and stuff like that.
Well, if they're LCSWs, Mike, they are. I mean, if they're LCSWs.
I understand that, but I'm only saying, I don't think that's the focus of their training based on.
Okay, so Paul?
No, Lori had her hand up first. I'll go
No,
after Lori.
I think you did. You did.
Oh, okay. I thought I saw hers
Lori
first,
was
but-
like going like this, and then all of a sudden she did.
Yeah. Okay. So I kind of read his letter different. There's a part of his letter that kind of makes it sound like that there's no real due process, that it's a kangaroo court for someone who has a diagnosis, that he's doing scientific research and bringing it into the court and it's just being ignored. And so I think that there's like to me, it just feels like there's not real due process going on, that facts aren't, admitted into evidence, and it's not really an adversarial process. It's a pretend process. So
I don't disagree with you, Paul. I think that's exactly what he was saying. But the point, I think the overarching point is the people who are supposed to be delivering the due process are completely out of their element in trying to figure this out. And, in the same way, I feel it's too much to expect of police officers to be experts on all these different things. I feel the same way about prosecutors. Like, they should not be getting stuck with this stuff unless it's a really serious, like a murder or stuff like that. But a lot of this is relatively low level stuff that's just clogging up. And if you talk to people in DOC, correctional officers, they'll tell you the same thing. Like, why are you sending all these people here? Because we are not equipped or trained to deal with this. And they only make our job more complicated. And many correctional officers will say, it's not fair to the inmates who are coming in with serious mental health issues, because we can see how they're decompensating here. So I'm saying, like, it's the very front end that someone needs to sort of come up with some metrics on, and so people can clearly understand what this real problem is. Right.
Okay, Paul, are you finished? Lori?
Yeah, sorry, I got kicked off for a second because of my internet, but I think I heard the gist of everything. And this is exactly why I wanted to, we talked about that subcommittee of the CJ PAC being sort of this, that interagency nexus of individuals that all kind of have to do with competency specifically, but other things, mental health. I know that at least in some recent meeting, there was discussion around gathering data about the competencies that come out of different areas, different jurisdictions and whatnot. Judges rotate, so that helps to provide, I think, some crossover, but it really, I think, is sort of person specific or jurisdiction specific. Like, if you send an attorney to a training about competency, the next week they would probably raise 10 competency evaluations, because it's, sort of provided to them to consider that. And I also don't know exactly how they use the social workers in the public defender's office. I mean, I will say that they would be trained sufficiently to be able to identify somebody who has mental health issues, particularly in working with the attorney, at least to call it into question, to raise the issue. But I'm not sure if they're certainly not in the room for every single, interaction. So it's probably a resource issue there as well. But certainly I think again, I can kind of say anecdotally, because I know where all the admissions are coming from. There are certain OFEs, there are 4 around the state, and there are certain ones that send us more referrals than others. So why that is, I don't know. Why certain courts send us more, I don't know. It could be that certain attorneys have, more exposure and experience in this, and so they raise the issue more often. There's been plenty of times that we've seen people come through our hospital where we've said, who have had like previous experience in the legal system, but never, competency was never raised, and we question how in the world that happens, where like, how in the world was this person ever make it through the process and nobody questioned their competency. So I think there's a lot of cases where it's an oversight, where it gets missed. And then there's probably a number of cases, there's certainly a number of cases where it might get raised when it's not necessary, or it's a way to get people treatment because, as Mike said, they don't know what else to do. So I definitely, again, being the psychologist on this committee, I'm very data driven. I think that is something that needs to be an ongoing thing, where people are constantly looking at where these things are coming from, what that means, and how we can implement these things that are going to divert the resources where they're going to do best, the most good.
I just wanted to share, I don't know if people are aware of the jail diversion program that DEMAS has. And way in the beginning of the war, Connecticut had the distinction of having more of our National Guard people in trouble with the law than any other state in the Union. And so we worked with the Yale Law School. They have what they call, veterans courts all over the United States, but our judiciary felt that we could not support, a veterans court in each one of our courts, but we could have. So what we worked out was this, and I, as I've been listening to you, I've been thinking about it. So the law now states that if anyone comes before as they are coming into the system, they are asked if they ever served in the military. And when they say yes, then, okay, the state of Connecticut has to actually verify that. Did they actually serve? And so if it is a misdemeanor or something that could be taken care of by having treatment or, some other social services, before they even come before the court, this is all talked out and decided, and treatment plans. They were given 3 places that they could actually, if they needed treatment, they could go to either Rocky Hill, they could go to the state of Connecticut, or they could go to the VA. But that the treatment plan had to be approved by the court. Mm. But that was much simpler, really, and much more, what do I want to say? Less demeaning to some of the people, and so they got into treatment. But they were also they had to I think they had probation officers that reported whether or not they were in the treatment.
That's not something that we all like. A lot of us look at that kind of a program and find it very coercive. You're coercing somebody to say, okay, I really don't want to go to jail. I really don't want treatment, but I guess if I have to have treatment, I'd rather have treatment than have to go to jail. It's a kind of forced treatment that Connecticut doesn't have. It takes choice away from people about what kind of a treatment they might want to have. So you need to know that this is not a program that a lot of us in this field, in clients' rights work, think is a good plan, and we would not support anything that goes along that kind of coercive nature.
Well, in actuality, it is a law in the state of Connecticut for veterans, and it has worked quite well the last 12 years, and they're in all states. So perhaps I understand your position, but you have to understand mine. That, veterans were in, when I became commissioner, there were a lot of veterans in prison for misdemeanors and never really were given a full assessment of their mental status. So that is what it is. I'm
not
not
everybody
changing
wants
it. That's
that.
what it is.
Not everybody wants that.
Well, you've got it. All right, Lori.
Well, I guess listening to that, my question would be, why isn't that something that's an opportunity for anybody?
Ugh.
Well, there
I mean,
was
you can come
a
from
lot
it
of
from that
use of
side
the
too.
jail
I mean, like,
diversion.
huh? Well, yeah, of
before.
course. And I meant to mention that as well, as far as the jail diversion. I mean, that's certainly something that when you have, again, usually it's social workers that work in the jail diversion, and they can sort of spot people who might be interested in treatment or willing to engage in treatment, and they can, they kind of bring that to the attorney's attention, and then they may go that route as well. But at any
Well,
rate,
jail diversion is a forced choice,
say again.
and the person has the right to make the decision. No one really tells them they have to. They can go to
Right.
jail if they.
It's an offer. It's an
Yeah.
opportunity.
I think that's just what I wanted to say, having worked in jail diversion programs on mental health and substance abuse for a long time. I know how it works, but I also, my hope is that social workers out there, whoever's doing the programs, that they're presenting the two options. They're not judging someone on either one that they pick, but that people have an option, and some people need to and want to know that and say, thank you for telling us. And again, I would just hope we're not judging people if they're choosing a way that we don't think is right. That it's a choice that they have right now in the system.
That's right, and it does actually, with a choice of where to go, the treatment plan is generated and the court approves the treatment plan.
Ugh.
Yes, Dr.
And
Otis.
again, that gets to the point of a court made up of a judge who is not a treatment provider. How a judge can approve or disapprove a treatment plan is utterly beyond me.
I have a hunch that he relies on who generated the treatment plan and what their
Then that's
credentials
not
were.
really approval. Then it's a myriad of problems.
It hopefully is options with choice.
Yeah.
I know it
It
doesn't.
is an option with choice.
I know it doesn't always work or feel that way though. So I understand.
Is there anything else? Yes, Dr. Otis.
I just, sorry to be rude. I have to run out for physical therapy, so I am going to have to sign off.
How are you doing?
I'm recovering, but I need therapy.
So you're not riding your bicycle yet?
Peloton now, Peloton. No more bicycles for me.
Okay.
Sorry to sign off, folks.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
We decide
Is
on a next meeting?
there, say again?
I was thinking, should we decide on a next meeting time?
Yes.
So isn't it 2 weeks from now? Or are we doing every other week?
I
don't know.
I am not sure that we need to meet every 2 weeks.
I'm not sure why we would want to slow down the process. We still. It's
entirely up to the group, but
Well, that's why I was asking before, what's our plan and what's our time frame? I think we have to be accountable to each other too.
I think
When
we
is
should
this reported? Who's starting to write it? When is it due? Who's doing
Right.
it?
well,
If
we asked
the-
for people to help us write. So Lori and I have been writing for about 4 months.
If the next step, I think, is Linda and I are finishing our
Okay.
final schmoozing of the report into like an initial working draft to the rest of the committee. So if we can get that to everybody, then the next step should just start to be like hashing through that, making sure that the points in it people agree with or don't, and then we can, we'll have to hash out what we dispute and either remove them or change them or whatever. But I think that's probably where we need to head next. So I guess my question would be, like, are people available to meet in 2 weeks, or like that would be the 23rd, or should it be the 30th? I mean, we should just like kind of pick a Friday that
whatever you need. Do you need 2 weeks or 3 weeks or?
Do we still need to be on Friday, Mike? Are you still teaching?
No, I start teaching again last week of August. So between, until then, I'm pretty flexible. But I'm just curious, like, Linda and Laura, like, do you think you'd have this rough draft ready within a
Well,
week or
I'm going to
so?
tell you what I'm thinking of, Lori, is I'm not talking about the smoothing part. I'm talking about what we have, just literally removing the salient points, the recommendations, and having them all decide whether they want to agree on it or not. But I'm
Well,
also
I
very cognizant of the fact that this document is embargoed. I don't want to read about it in the Connecticut Mirror the day after we give it to you, because people meet us on the street, and I had a very interesting encounter over the 4th of July that I don't think I signed up for.
Do you want
Well,
to
you
share
can't
it or?
borrow it from us. We need to be able to see it. So,
Yeah, I think it's close enough that and I guess I would say, I would offer it.
All right,
do
I'm going
think-
to say this, though.
I do think
I would
that,
like a vote from the people of this committee that it is embargoed
Yeah.
until we make the final decision.
To me, that's
that's
understood,
that's
but
understood. It's a
You should-
draft.
No, it's not
It's
understood.
not even, it
I
does.
think the
it's
word
not-
is confidential.
Yeah, yeah, it's confidential and it's not even FOIA-able until it's a final version. So that goes without saying.
I'll put the draft watermark on it if it makes you.
Yeah,
Sure.
that's a good idea. Sure.
But I do think it's close enough that, and I think it might make the most sense to give it in full, rather than like the specific recommendations, because they might not make sense without the finding. Like you went to the trouble of separating out the findings and the recommendations, and I think that makes sense because it helps the flow. So maybe we can kind of get it in working order by next week, and
Not next week. No.
not next. Okay, so 2 weeks maybe, and then, so should we put this next meeting to the 30th?
I think that's good,
The 30th?
my opinion.
I can do the 30th.
Of July, right?
Yep.
And at this time, right?
Yep.
Got it.
Mhm.
Okay.
So not the 6th, okay. All right. 30th.
Well, I see it's after 3. Is there a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
I see 4 motions to adjourn, so all those in favor, oh, you're doing. All those in favor say aye. See
Aye.
you on the 30th.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Someone should let John